In the opening days of 2026, Ukrainian drones began appearing over the capital with a frequency Moscow had never faced before. And this was not a symbolic strike or a one-night spectacle. It was a sustained pressure campaign that dragged the war directly into Moscow's airspace and refused to let go. Air defenses were forced to activate night after night, not in response to a distant front, but in defense of the capital itself. Sirens, radar sweeps, and interceptor launches became routine. Moscow was no longer reacting to a war happening elsewhere. It was defending itself on a schedule it did not control. Behind closed doors, internal estimates started circulating. By the end of the first week, financial losses were already assessed at more than $2 billion, and those figures were rising fast. Even as they were written down, they were becoming obsolete. This was not the result of a single strike. It was the cost of repetition. At the start of 2026, the tempo of the war shifted decisively. Ukraine did not announce a new phase or make speeches about escalation. It simply struck Moscow again and again, turning frequency into a weapon. What had once been sporadic, symbolic UAV appearances became near daily pressure. Russian officials acknowledged a growing number of Ukrainian drones intercepted over the Moscow region in the first days of the year, while nationwide figures climbed even faster. These were not routine numbers, and they were not accidents. They pointed to something deliberate unfolding in real time. The message was direct. This was no longer about one dramatic night or a carefully staged political signal. Ukraine abandoned spectacle and embraced persistence, forcing Moscow to respond every evening, every alert, every radar sweep. Air defense crews stayed active. Crews stayed awake. Interceptors were fired repeatedly to destroy drones that cost a fraction of the missiles used against them. Moscow stopped waiting for the next attack because it was already living inside one. On January 2nd, late at night, the first Ukrainian UAVs approached Vnukovo Airport from the southwest, flying low and deliberately slow. This was not a mass swarm. It was a calculated entry designed to slip into civilian air corridors before detection. When radar finally locked on, Moscow's air defenses reacted immediately. Interceptors launched. The sky above the airport flashed as the first drones were destroyed. The response was loud, expensive, and urgent. It was also incomplete. Hours later, another group followed offset in direction and timing. Air defense crews had no chance to stand down. Sirens echoed again. Aircraft already on approach were forced to abort or divert. Ground operations slowed sharply. Vnukovo did not need to be struck directly to be neutralized. The threat alone achieved that result. On January 3rd, just after midnight, the pattern repeated. New UAV contacts appeared. New interceptions followed. Missile after missile was fired to stop drones that cost almost nothing by comparison. By then, it was clear this was not a test run. It was pressure through repetition, and each engagement drained resources, exhausted crews, and sharpened frustration inside Moscow's command structure. By January 4th, the situation could no longer be dismissed or downplayed. Air defense units around Vnukovo had been active across multiple nights, and disruptions to civil aviation were stacking up. The sense of control Moscow relied on was visibly eroding. That night, Russian authorities issued their first consolidated acknowledgement. Since the start of the year, 57 Ukrainian UAVs had been intercepted over the Moscow region alone. That number was not reassurance. It was confirmation that the pressure campaign had already taken hold. Nationwide, the number had already climbed to nearly 440 drones. That was the first official snapshot of scale, and it was already obsolete by the time it surfaced. The attacks did not slow as the calendar moved forward. They pushed deeper, shifting decisively inward toward the defensive ring around Moscow itself. After the sustained pressure on Vnukovo, the direction was unmistakable. The outer layer had been tested. The focus moved straight toward the inner shield protecting the capital. On January 5, 2026, shortly after midnight, Ukrainian UAVs approached from multiple vectors, staggered in timing and altitude. Some flew low to stretch radar coverage. Others followed minutes later, forcing operators to stay locked on their screens without relief. Air defense units engaged repeatedly. Interceptors rose and detonated above the outskirts, lighting the sky in sharp flashes. Sirens echoed, then fell silent just long enough to give the illusion of an end before the next contact appeared. By January 6th, this rhythm had become routine. Batteries fired again and again through the night. Radar systems remained active without pause. Crews rotated under fatigue, knowing that standing down was no longer an option. Russian statements continued to emphasize successful interceptions, but no updated totals were released. That silence mattered. By January 7th, the scale of the operation was clearly beyond the figures acknowledged only days earlier. While no official update appeared, analysts tracking air defense activity and missile launches estimated that dozens more UAVs had been engaged around the capital since January 4th alone. The true count was almost certainly far higher than the last announced numbers. The cost of this defense was no longer abstract. Each interception required surface-to-air missiles, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more than $1 million per shot. By conservative estimates, tens of millions of dollars in interceptor missiles were expended around Moscow in less than a week. Add to that the expense of continuous radar operation emergency aviation measures and non-stop personnel deployment, and the financial toll climbed sharply. This was the imbalance Ukraine was exploiting. Cheap replaceable UAVs forcing an expensive irreplaceable defensive posture. The inner ring did not collapse, but it was compelled to fight every night without relief. And by January 7th, the absence of updated official figures suggested a deeper problem Moscow was not eager to quantify publicly. The scale was still growing, and Ukraine was no longer asking whether the shield could intercept. The question was how long the shield could endure financially, mechanically, and humanly before the cost itself became the damage. By the second week of January, the impact could no longer be measured by explosions or debris alone. The damage Moscow was absorbing was systemic, and it was mounting. Interceptors costing hundreds of thousands, some approaching 7 figures, were fired night after night, turning defense into a steady financial bleed. Missiles were only part of the bill. Radar networks ran continuously, pushing systems designed for intermittent use into sustained operation. Maintenance cycles shortened. Failure risks rose. Crews operated under exhaustion as extended shifts became routine rather than exceptional. The city's defensive posture shifted from readiness to attrition. Civil aviation absorbed its own shock as repeated alerts forced temporary airspace restrictions, diversions, and ground holds. Airports did not need to shut down permanently to suffer losses. Uncertainty alone was enough to disrupt schedules, crews, fuel planning, and logistics. Each alert added friction. Each delay compounded. The psychological toll followed close behind. Sirens became familiar. Flashes over the skyline were no longer rare. Residents adjusted routines around warnings they could not predict or ignore. The sense that the war happened somewhere else began to erode, and still the attacks continued. Ukraine's calculus was simple and ruthless. Cheap drones, expensive responses. Replaceable UAVs imposing irreplaceable strain on systems, budgets, and people. No single interception looked catastrophic. Together they formed a pattern that was far harder to absorb and even harder to explain away. By this point, officials avoided updated totals altogether. Numbers lagged behind events, and the silence spoke louder than confirmations ever could. It suggested not control, but containment of the narrative. This was the damage being inflicted. Not ruins on the ground, but pressure spreading across balance sheets, schedules, and nerves night after night, with no clear end in sight. As Moscow paid this price, night after night, one truth became unavoidable. A war of attrition does not require destruction. By the time the calendar moved past January 7th, the pattern was undeniable. This was no longer a series of attacks. It was one system grinding against another above Moscow night after night without pause. Ukraine's approach was brutally efficient, not dramatic, not symbolic, just relentlessly functional. Low-cost UAVs were launched in repeated sequences, sometimes singly, sometimes in small clusters, always spaced to force maximum reaction. Each drone demanded attention. Each contact triggered tracking confirmation authorization, and in most cases, a missile launch. The math was unforgiving. A single interceptor costs anywhere from hundreds of thousands to well over $1 million. A UAV costs a fraction of that. Multiply this exchange across multiple engagements per night, across several nights in a row, and the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Even conservative estimates point to tens of millions of dollars burned in interceptor launches alone within days. And attrition did not stop at money. Missile stocks thinned, reload cycles accelerated. Air defense batteries designed for episodic use were pushed into continuous combat readiness. Radar systems ran hot. Crews rotated without real recovery. Fatigue crept in quietly, steadily, the most dangerous way possible. This was the battlefield Ukraine chose. Not one decisive strike, but a rhythm Moscow could not interrupt. Every successful interception still counted as a defensive win, but each one deepened the strain. The shield worked, but it worked at a cost that accumulated invisibly until it could no longer be denied. Attrition does not announce itself. It reveals itself through shortages, delays, and mistakes. Ukraine did not need to overwhelm the defenses. It only needed to keep them firing. And the longer this exchange continued, the clearer the strategic trap became. Moscow could not stop responding. It could not afford to miss. Yet every response made the next night harder, not easier. Above the capital, the war settled into a cold equation. Cheap drones in the air, expensive missiles in response, and a defensive system being asked to do the impossible hold forever. In wars like this, victory does not come from breaking the shield in one blow. It comes from making the shield exhaust itself. By the end of the first week of January, the transformation was undeniable. Moscow was no longer a distant command center managing a war elsewhere. It had become part of the battlefield. For decades, the capital existed behind layers of assumption, distance, power, and control. War was something pushed outward, absorbed by border regions and distant cities. That assumption collapsed as Ukrainian UAVs forced air defenses to fire above Moscow, night after night. The shield held, but the illusion did not. By this point, Russian authorities had acknowledged only an initial portion of the engagements. No updated official totals were released after January 4th, yet air defense activity told its own story. Independent assessments based on launch frequency radar activity and logistical strain indicated that the number of UAVs engaged around the capital had grown far beyond the first public figures. By January 7th, the real count was almost certainly dozens higher, possibly more. The cost followed the same trajectory, with interceptors ranging from hundreds of thousands to over $1 million each. Analysts assessed that the defensive effort around Moscow alone likely crossed the $50 to $70 million mark in a single week. That figure did not include radar operations, emergency aviation measures, or the human cost of sustained high-alert duty. But the deeper damage was symbolic and strategic. Sirens over Moscow changed the meaning of the war. Air defense flashes over residential districts altered public perception. The capital was no longer insulated. It was exposed to the same uncertainty it had long imposed elsewhere. Each alert eroded the sense of permanence and control that power depends on. Ukraine understood this shift. It was not trying to seize territory or destroy landmarks. It was doing something far more destabilizing, normalizing the idea that Moscow itself could be pressured, not once, not theatrically, but repeatedly, predictably, relentlessly. This is how capitals lose their aura, not through collapse, but through repetition. As the days passed without new official numbers, the silence grew louder than any announcement. It signaled hesitation and an unwillingness to put a final figure on a problem that was still expanding. In warfare, silence at the center usually means strain at the edges, and Moscow was beginning to show it. Ukraine had achieved a strategic inversion. The city that once dictated the rhythm of the war was now reacting to it. Each night, Moscow waited for the next alert. Each morning, it counted the cost of having defended itself yet again. The attacks did not end the war, but they shifted where the war was felt. And once a capital grows accustomed to sirens, interceptions, and uncertainty, the illusion of distance disappears. By early January 2026, the message was no longer subtle. Ukraine did not need to announce escalation. Sirens over Moscow did that work for them. What began as pressure hardened into routine. What was once unthinkable became familiar. The attacks did not level buildings or redraw maps, but they rewrote expectations. Moscow learned that distance no longer guarantees safety, and power no longer ensures insulation. Every interception carried a cost. Every quiet morning followed a tense night. This was not about a single strike or a dramatic headline. It was about persistence, about forcing a capital to react again and again, until defense itself becomes a burden. That is the deeper shift this moment represents. When war reaches the center, it changes how long a nation believes it will endure. The question is no longer whether Moscow can defend itself. The question is how long it will continue paying the price of doing so night after night, without relief.